This is the continuation of the lecture on anatomy of the respiratory tract. So in this lecture, we are going to talk about the structure of lower respiratory tract. Hope you remember that the lower respiratory tract starts from the point of larynx. Larynx is also called as the voice box of our body, and it is the connection point of upper and the lower respiratory airways. It is formed by several pieces of cartilages, and the most important part of larynx is vocal ligaments. There are two sets of ligaments around the opening of the larynx. We call that opening the glottis. There are a set of true vocal cords, which we call the vocal folds. They are involved in active sound production. But there is another set of ligaments, which we call false vocal cords, and also we call them vestibular folds. They do not really involve in sound production. So you can see in this image the glottis, the opening of the larynx through which the air goes up and down. And the glottis is surrounded by two sets of ligaments called true vocal cords and false vocal cords. And also the larynx is composed of 7 irregular shaped cartilages attached to each other by ligaments and membranes. Let's see what are the functions of larynx. The production of sound is the main function of larynx. The sounds produced by larynx has different properties such as pitch, volume, and resonance or tone. These properties depend on the features of vocal cords such as the length and the tightness of the cords, the force with which the cords vibrate, and etc. The sound produced by the vocal cords are changed by the tongue, cheeks, and lips and convert them into words. Then only speech produced. Therefore, larynx is important in production of speech. And the other one is that protection of lower respiratory tract during swallowing. The larynx moves upward and blocks the opening of the pharynx into larynx with the help of epiglottis. This ensures that food passes into the esophagus, not into the lower respiratory passage. Larynx also acts as a passageway for incoming air. It leads the incoming air from pharynx into the trachea. The thyroid and the cricoid cartilages maintain an open passage for the air movement. Other than that, the pharynx is involved in humidification, filtering, and warming of incoming air. As this incoming air travels through the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, it gets humidified, filtered, and warmed. The next organ of the lower respiratory tract is trachea. It is also called the windpipe. It is the continuation of the larynx and a tube which is made up of a dense regular connective tissue and a layer of smooth muscles. The trachea is supported by 15 to 20 C-shaped pieces of hyaline cartilages. These cartilages support only the anterior and the lateral side of the trachea. The posterior wall of the trachea do not have this hyaline cartilage. As they are cartilages, they are important to protect the trachea, and also they support in order to maintain an open passage when air travels through. As you know, hyaline cartilages are much more flexible than other cartilages, and also the shape, they are C-shaped. So this shape and the flexibility of cartilages are facilitated, or they allow the expansion of the trachea when air goes through it. As I have mentioned earlier, the wall of the trachea also contains a layer of smooth muscles, which is called trachealis muscle. Contraction of the smooth muscle layer can narrow the diameter of the trachea. When we are talking about the mucous membrane, it lines with a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium which contain numerous goblet cells. Let's see the functions of trachea. The first function is it provides supports to the air passageway. The cartilages prevent the collapse of tube when the internal pressure is less than the external pressure. The second is it maintains mucociliary escalator, that is, the movement of cilia of the mucous membrane and move this mucus with adherent particles towards the larynx to be swallowed or expectorated. The other function is the cough reflex. The nerve ending in the larynx, trachea and bronchi are sensitive to irritations. Then it generates nerve impulses to remove these mucus or foreign materials from the mouth. And it also continues warming, humidification and filtering of air by the pseudostratified columnar epithelium with lot of goblet cells. Sometimes the air is saturated or reached at body temperature when it reaches the trachea. Then the trachea divides into two primary bronchi at the point of carina. Then it forms the right bronchus and the left bronchus. Beginning with the trachea, the all respiratory passages that belongs to the lower respiratory tract are called tracheobronchial tree. When we are considering the primary bronchi, the right bronchus is wider, shorter, and more vertical than the left bronchus. Therefore, it is more likely to become obstructed by inhaled foreign particles. The left bronchus is longer and is narrower than the right one because in the left side the heart is located. Therefore, this left bronchus is longer and narrower than the right one. Now the bronchial tree is inside the lung. As we know, the lung is mainly divided into lobes. The main bronchi divides into smaller passages and goes into each lobe. So these are called lobar bronchi or secondary bronchi. And then these lobes of the lung divides into segments. So in the same way, the lobar bronchi is again divided into smaller passages and get into these segments. So we call them segmental bronchi or tertiary bronchi. The bronchial tree continue to branching and finally giving rise to bronchioles. These bronchioles are less than 1 millimeter in diameter. These 1 millimeter wide bronchioles then progressively subdivide into bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and finally alveoli. So these bronchioles subdivide several times to become smaller passageways. Approximately 16 generations of branching occur from the trachea to the terminal bronchioles. As the passageways become smaller, the structure of their walls changes according to their function. Let's see what are the structural changes that can be seen towards the distal end of the bronchi. First, the cartilages become smaller and they are absent at the bronchiolar level. So, the smooth muscles in the wall of the bronchioles become thicker in order to provide support as they absent cartilages. But when they come to alveolar ducts or alveoli, the smooth muscle layer is also become absent because they are at this side they need to facilitate the gas exchange. And the ciliated epithelium is gradually replaced with non-ciliated epithelium towards the distal end of the bronchi. Also, goblet cells become disappeared. The goblet cells are not there, cilia is not there, mucus is not there. That is because when they are reaching the respiratory portion of the lower respiratory tract, now they are already filtered and cleaned. What are the functions of air passages that are not involved in gaseous exchange? They are in control of air entry by changing the diameter of the respiratory tract. And they are also involved in warming and humidification of incoming air. They also provide support and removal of particulate matter through cough reflex. The terminal bronchioles divide to form respiratory bronchioles. Approximately 7 generations of branching occur from the terminal bronchioles to the alveolar duct. Finally, they form a structure called lobule. Lobules are the blind ends of the respiratory tract, which composed of respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. So these are the structures that process of gas exchange. The walls of respiratory bronchioles consist of collagenous and elastic connective tissue with bundles of smooth muscles. But the walls gradually become thinner until muscles and connective tissues fade out. The epithelium in the respiratory bronchioles is a simple cuboidal epithelium. The alveolar ducts and alveoli consist of simple squamous epithelium. So you can see as they goes down that the thickness of the wall become very thin. That is because in order to facilitate the gas exchange between the lungs and the blood vessels. There in alveoli, where the active gas exchange occurs, is surrounded by a dense network of capillaries in order to facilitate an effective gas exchange. It is also covered with the surfactant, which prevents the alveoli from drying out. The surfactant also reduces surface tension and prevents alveolar walls collapsing during expiration. When we are considering the microscopic anatomy of alveoli, they have elastic walls that allow them to stretch during air intake. And also, they are lined by a single layer of simple squamous epithelial cells which facilitate effective gas exchange through them. The active gas exchange takes place across the structure called respiratory membrane. It is formed by fusion of two structures, the alveolar wall and capillary wall. So we can see the respiratory membrane consists only with two cell layers, one from the alveolar wall, the simple squamous layer, and the other from capillary or the blood vessel wall, that is endothelium. What are the functions of respiratory bronchioles and alveoli? The first function is they are involved in external expiration, that is, active gas exchange between the lung and the blood vessels. The second function is they provide defense against microbes. At this level, ciliated epithelium, goblet cells, and mucus are no longer present. Therefore, defense relies mainly on protective cells present within the lung tissue. And they also provide warming and humidifying. These continue as in the upper airways. Now let's see the gross anatomy of lungs. There are two lungs, one lying on each side of midline in the thoracic cavity. They are cone-shaped and are described as having an apex, a base, costal surface, and medial surface. The medial surface have a roughly triangular shaped area called hilum. The structures which form the root of the lung enter and leave each lung at the hilum. The root of the lung include the primary bronchus, the pulmonary artery, the two pulmonary veins, the bronchial artery and veins, the lymphatic vessels, and also nerve supply. In this image, you can see the hilum of the lung from where the root of lung enters and exits the lungs. The area between the right and left lungs is the mediastinum. It is occupied by heart and great vessels, trachea, right and left bronchi, esophagus, lymph nodes and vessels, and nerves. When we are talking about the organization of the lungs, the right lung is divided into three distinct lobes, the superior, middle, and inferior. But the left lung is smaller as the heart is situated left side of the midline. Therefore, it is divided into only two lobes, superior and inferior. These lobes are made up of a large number of lobules. In this image, you can see the organization of the lungs, the lobes of each lung, And you can see the cardiac notch, the space where in the left lung which facilitate the accommodation of the heart. When we are considering the interior structure of the lung substance is composed of the bronchi, the smaller airways, alveoli, connective tissue, blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. Let's see about the pleura and the pleural cavity. So, the pleura consists of a closed sac of serous membrane, one serous membrane for each lung. The lung is invaginated into this sac so that it forms two layers. One layer adheres to the lung and the other to the wall of the thoracic cavity. A small amount of serous fluid is present between these two layers of the membrane. The visceral pleura is adherent to the lung surface, covering each lobe and passing into the fissures which separate these lobes. The parietal pleura, the outer layer, is adherent to the inside of the chest wall and the thoracic surface of the diaphragm. It is detached from the adjacent structures in the mediastinum, and it is continuous with the visceral pleura around the edges of hilum. This picture gives you the idea about this pleura, that you can see the visceral pleura which is attached to the surface of the lung, and then the parietal pleura which is attached to the inside of the thoracic wall. And in the lower picture you can see that pleura is not attached with the other organs exist in the mediastinum. The two layers of this pleura are separated only by a thin film of serous fluid. It allows them to glide over each other, preventing friction between them during breathing. The serous fluid is secreted by the epithelial cells of the membrane. The space between the two layers do not contain any air. It is totally filled with serous fluid and allows them to glide over each other, preventing friction between them during breathing. Let's see about the blood supply to lungs. The pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary artery divides into right and left pulmonary arteries. They transport deoxygenated blood to each lung, and they form a dense capillary network around alveoli. Then these capillaries join up and form two pulmonary veins from each lung. They carry oxygenated blood to the heart. The lymph drainage of lungs and bronchi. The lungs have two lymphatic supplies, the superficial lymphatic vessels and deep lymphatic vessels. The superficial lymphatic vessels lie deep to the visceral pleura. They drain lymph from the superficial lung tissue and the visceral pleura. The deep lymphatic vessels follow the bronchi. They drain lymph from bronchi and associated connective tissues. But there are no lymphatic vessels located in the walls of alveoli. Both of these superficial and deep lymphatic vessels exit the lung at the hilum. The importance of this lymph drainage of lungs is that the cancer cells from the lungs can sometimes spread to the other part of your body through lymphatic vessels. The phagocytic cells that lie within the lungs take carbon particles and other debris from incoming air and move them to the lymphatic vessels. But in an older people, especially who smoke throughout the life or who live most of their life in a city with air pollution, these particles accumulate and cause the surface of lungs to become gray or black color. So this is the end of the second part of the lecture. In the next part, we will discuss the mechanism of the ventilation.